Okay, let's have a look at how the government in the 19th century responded to protest and demonstration against the authorities. Okay, we know the 19th century, this is the period you studied in Year 9. It's a period of enormous change and struggle in England. England is undergoing the world's first industrial revolution. There's a huge movement of people from the countryside into the cities. It's the growth of the factory system. And we know that people lived, the ordinary people, the vast majority of the population, lived appalling lives of hardship, low life expectancy, and they wanted change. They wanted to change the way Britain was run. They wanted more say in how the government was elected. We know that the vast majority of people had a very poor living conditions, poor working conditions. They were exploited by their employers often. They worked for very low wages. They lived in appalling housing conditions, so they wanted to change the system. They wanted reform. They wanted reform of Parliament. In the early 19th century, Parliament was elected by a tiny percent of the population. Something like 10% of people had the right to vote, and these were the rich, moneyed classes who made laws that protected their own interests. And we've seen that before when we looked at poaching and landowners. They're passing laws to protect their own interests. So the English people looked at France and saw what happened in France, and some of them did, admire what happened during the French Revolution. But more particularly, the rich, moneyed classes, the aristocracy, the governing classes, looked at what happened in France and they were appalled, they were horrified, because the French Revolution had stripped the wealthy of their land and property. Thousands of people had been executed, the world had been turned upside down, if you like, and the English looked at what was happening in France and were terrified the same thing would happen in England. So they passed law after law that was designed to make sure that the poor working people would never think about rising up against them. So how did this contrast with the poor people? They simply wanted the right to vote, they wanted the right to strike if necessary, and the right to criticise their own government. This is what they wanted reform for. How did the government respond to this? They simply brought in law after law that restricted the rights of ordinary people to protest and demonstrate for these rights. There was no police force, there was no thought of bringing in a police force, so the government relied on the army or the yeomanry to police any demonstration or any form of protest that might happen. They wanted to control the vast majority of the population. They wanted to ensure that there was never anything like the French Revolution in England. Okay. The two forms of protest that we're particularly interested in are one in Manchester and one in the southern counties of England. The first one, it happens at a place called St Peter's Fields, which is a place, a recreation ground outside Manchester. And in this particular protest, 50,000 unarmed people met to campaign, to protest for reform. They wanted the right to vote, for example. And 50,000 of them, men, women and children, met to listen to speakers, to voice their opposition to the government. They're asking for more rights. How did the government respond? Well, it sent in the army or the yeomanry, and it sent them in on horseback. And by all accounts, a group of cavalrymen rode into the middle of the demonstration and hacked away at the protesters with their swords. It caused chaos. 18 people were killed. And it becomes famously known as Peterloo, making reference to the huge battle that had taken place 4 years earlier in 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. It becomes a battle, not a protest, but a battle where people are left dead. And what can we learn from this particular demonstration? That the government, the authorities, were prepared to use force and violence against those protesters who it was determined to control, to suppress. And it's a very famous protest in the 19th century. That becomes known as Peterloo, of course. Another protest that we're interested in is, of course, that of the Tolpuddle martyrs. In Dorset, this happens in 1833. We're interested in a group of farm workers, farm labourers, who are employed by the week for a pathetic amount of money. They are the worst paid workers in the whole of Britain. Worse paid than factory workers, mine workers. If you want to go back to a time of real hardship, it's the lives of these poor people who are living hand to mouth in the villages and small towns of England, rural England, during this period. They're so frustrated or annoyed at not being able to gain better money, for example, and a right to work for a longer period of time rather than being hired and fired on a weekly basis, they decide to form a trade union. Trade unions are not illegal, but they realise that if word gets around to their employees that they have formed a trade union, they will not be very happy about it, and they will pick on them and they will fire them. So they join a trade union, and they make sure that those people who are joining the trade union do so in secret, and they take a secret oath to respect the aims of the trade union and not let anybody else know that they have formed a trade union. The government hears about this. First of all, the local landowner hears about it. The local landowner is a member of the local aristocracy. He has friends and relatives in Parliament, and he and his friends are determined to squash this attempt to form a trade union. As I said before, it's not illegal to be a part of a trade union, but the government and the authorities and the legal system use a law designed to squash mutiny in the Navy against these trade unionists. How can they do that? Because the law stipulated that you can't take secret oaths in the Navy, and these trade unionists had taken a secret oath when they formed their trade union. So they are put on trial, they're arrested, they're put on trial, they're convicted of taking these secret oaths, and they are sentenced to transportation to Australia simply for forming a trade union. And they are held in hulks, in shackles, and eventually sent out to Australia under appalling conditions, and are treated brutally when they arrive in Australia. Back in England, there's a huge outcry amongst working people. There are demonstrations, protests, petitions, all designed to get these martyrs back to the UK, to get them pardoned, which eventually succeeds. This petition, this attempt to get them pardoned eventually succeeds 3 years after they are convicted. When they arrive back in the UK, they are largely forgotten, they are not able to get their jobs back, and they feel absolutely frustrated at their circumstances, and most of them emigrate back to Canada. What can we learn from this episode? That the government was prepared to use the law, draconian laws, and manipulate the law again to try and squash dissent and protest. Later on, this hard-hearted attitude towards protest will become softened. As the century wears on, the government will become, I wouldn't say more lenient, but more prepared to change the law to give some of these people what they want, rather than use force and violence and intimidation to stop these protests. Okay, how can we remember all of this stuff? We did a little mnemonic in class and revision, if you remember. Government response to protest. What do we need to remember? That for the vast majority of people, they had poor living, working, social conditions. They wanted reform. The authorities, on the other hand, had seen what had happened in